All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to day two of TransCon 2021. Um, we have the privilege of being one of two tracks kicking off this morning. This is the Aviation and Aerospace track, and my name is Andy Hume, and I have the privilege of both moderating and speaking on this track. So hope you enjoy this, and we look forward to focusing our presentation on Las Cruces International Airport. And just as a little intro, I want to just give you a little flavor of what we're going to be talking about. Las Cruces International Airport is a key transportation facility in the Mesilla Valley. The airport has played a vital role in aviation and will continue to do so. Regional growth in aviation and aerospace highlight economic development opportunities and the bright future for the airport. So we're very excited to talk to you about Las Cruces International Airport, both from an aviation perspective and from an aerospace perspective. So I'm very happy to have with me two very distinguished speakers, Mr. Dale Amon and Mr. James Bennett, and we will hear from them in just a little bit here in the presentation. So thank you very much again for joining us, and we'll dive right in. So I'm going to provide an introduction here, first of all, to our airport. For those of you who may not be familiar with Las Cruces International Airport, we'll talk about the airport itself, and we'll talk about some of the priorities that we've been working on and some planning for the future. And then we're going to talk specifically about one aspect of the future of aviation for the airport, which is the potential for passenger air service. There's been some really exciting developments in that, in those possibilities for Las Cruces. And then we'll move on and we'll talk more about some aerospace opportunities, potential opportunities for the airport in the future, in the later presentations. So this is the layout of the airport. You'll notice Las Cruces has 3 runways. The airport has 3 runways. And this is really important for Las Cruces. Typically, airports of our size maybe have 1 or 2 at the most. We're blessed with 3. And for anyone who is familiar with Las Cruces, especially this time of year, I know we can't all be down here in southern New Mexico in the springtime this year. Hopefully next year we will be. But the wind can shift directions quite readily, particularly this time of year. And so having 3 runways is very important because it allows for pilots to take off and land safely into the wind. And that's really critical from an aerodynamic perspective. And so 3 runways is really a blessing for us here at the airport. The airport is also served by multiple taxiways, as you can see. And then along the southern boundary down here, we have a lot of taxi lanes and hangars that are available down here. And this is where all of our support facilities are, our terminal and other facilities are located. I'm not going to read through all of this history, but I wanted to provide a sort of at a glance for you all. The history of this airport starts right in World War II, right in the middle of World War II. At that time, the U.S. Army had an Air Force within it. The Air Force, as we know it today, did not exist at that time. And so the U.S. Army was setting up a lot of air bases across the country for training during World War II. Now, the main air base in our area was set up in Deming, but they needed an auxiliary air base. And so the one that is now our airport was set up here in Las Cruces. And so it began functioning in around 1942-43 timeframe. So fast forward to 1955, and along with a lot of other air bases around the country, the Department of Defense and the realized that they didn't need these all of these air bases, and so a lot of them were transitioned over through the Department of the Interior to municipalities, and that's what happened with our airport, and that took place in 1955. So the airport that you see now, along with about 2,200 acres, was transitioned from the federal government over to the municipality, and that became the beginning of our airport. Now, again, I'm not going to read through all of the dates, all of the key times and projects and everything else, but one thing that I do want to make note of, it's very critical, is that the leaders of Las Cruces did something very important for the airport. And through the course of time, over the course of a couple of decades, particularly in the 80s and 90s, there were either direct acquisitions by the city or the acquisition of patents by the city of the lands around that initial 2,200 acres. And that was really critical because it preserves the area around the airport. And that's in many cases a very big problem for a lot of municipal airports, because you have the airport that starts off in what seems like the middle of nowhere, and then the city around it grows in and in closer and closer, and then all of a sudden that airport is restricted, and there certainly are, there become noise complaints and everything else, and so the operations of that airport become restricted, and now what it can do and the economic development opportunities at that airport might be restricted as well. So that's really the foresight for our airport. So the area surrounding the airport has a significant buffer around it that we benefit from up through today. So what are the critical airport priorities? Well, these are general priorities no matter what airport you have. And these priorities factor into not only the everyday decisions that are made by my team, but also they factor into long-range planning and budgeting and those types of things. So number one concern always is safety and security, and the safety of the pilots, safety of the users, and the security of the aircraft and all of the activities that go on there. Also important in this is, as the second bullet says, that level of activity. We've already mentioned that. The economic vitality and vibrancy of the area. We have an adjoining innovation and industrial park, and how those two work together are very critical in looking at the benefits that we can bring to our area. We'll talk about the potential for commercial passenger service as well. And again, coordinating with those other goals in the area of economic development are very critical. So these are just really crucial priorities that are part of, again, not only our everyday activities, but as we look short, medium, and long-term planning and implementation of airport projects and planning. So this is just a snapshot of what our current preferred layout plan is. You'll notice it's based on the original layout that I showed at the outset. And in this plan, they're showing, in particular, you'll see there are runway extensions. And I'll just sort of point to a little bit. Let me see if I can get my laser pointer here. There we go. So you'll see runway extensions here for this proposed for runway 1230 over here to the northwest, and then also extensions to runway 8 and 26 over here. Also expansions to the area down here in the south where we're looking at perhaps building more hangars, and then also proposals to expand areas for perhaps hopefully maybe attracting cargo development, aircraft maintenance, and the like. And so as we move ahead, there are certainly plans that we have for the future to look at growth for the airport and economic development opportunities. So I want to talk just a little bit about a study that was recently concluded that was looking at the evaluation of air service, returning air service to Las Cruces. These are the high-level findings. We're going to drill down into this just a little bit. The importance of these findings is they were done pre-COVID, and we're going to talk about pre-COVID versus post-COVID. But there are a couple of very key takeaways. One is that according to their findings, there are approximately 650 daily inbound and outbound passengers from the Las Cruces area that are going in and out of El Paso. And that's important because it shows that there is a potential passenger base for the Las Cruces International Airport. And in particular, in the research that was done, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Phoenix appear to be the best fit for this passenger service, for providing this passenger service. So a lot of research was done in this phase 1 study. There was data that was gathered. There were surveys that were done. There was a lot of data mining, if you will. They looked at flight volumes, passenger data, where trips were originating and ending. We looked at residents who are from our area, from our catchment area, as well as tourists, people who are just coming here to come here for the purpose of visiting, but not necessarily staying, because both have different needs and different travel patterns. So there was a lot of different data that was looked at in the course of this project. And so when we get into looking at the numbers, these numbers were very interesting. So if we look at the opportunities here, first of all, this number is very telling right here. This is, again, pre-COVID. Over 3 million. Remember this, you need to double this, right? Over 3 million travelers going inbound and outbound of El Paso in 2019. 2019 was a very busy travel year. That's where the hit from COVID really hit the airlines very hard. And if you notice, a significant amount of that travel is coming from our area, coming from the Las Cruces area, coming from nearby counties that travel through.
What are you doing?
Perhaps somebody needs to mute their microphone. Thank you. A significant amount of travel coming from our catchment area and traveling to El Paso International Airport. And so I'm not going to read through this entire breakdown here. This information is posted that you can look at it in a little bit more detail. But even if we look at percentages of where those trips are going, and we break down that 650 up at the top, trips going eastbound, trips going westbound, where we would have a competitive advantage over El Paso and where we might not. Even if we break down those items, you'll notice that there are 77 trips that perhaps we would have a competitive advantage going to Phoenix, and 277 where we would have going to Dallas, eastbound and westbound in those trips. And so if we take a look at those numbers, even if we capture a percentage of those numbers, you can see that results in 2 to 4 flights to the DFW market and 1 to 2 flights in the Phoenix market. And what this tells us is supply and demand, right? Because that's what it's all about. It's all about supply and demand. The airlines are not doing this out of a charity. They want to, if they're going to put a plane here and pilots and everything else, they're going to want to do it to have to make money. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And so when we're looking at this, that's what we want to look at, is how do we show them that this would be worth it for them to invest here in Las Cruces. Now, we all know what happened right around here, right around the end of March. The bottom dropped out of the travel industry, and we really have not seen, and this is toward the end of last year, but really numbers have not gotten much better than this. We've been tracking them very closely. They've gotten maybe a little bit better, but not much better than this. But where we have seen some movement is in charter service and in service to smaller airports like ours. And so we still see that there are some opportunities for smaller airports like ours, and we are continuing with a phase 2 study to look at what opportunities that those airlines still want to serve in the Las Cruces area. So what I would like everyone to do, particularly if you're in the Las Cruces area, is stay tuned for seeing the phase 2 study. And because we are moving forward with that, and see how you can be involved in that, see how you can stay in touch with that. So we're excited about the possibilities of moving forward with that next phase. So hopefully, as we're saying, from LRU to the world, because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about connecting from an aviation perspective. We're talking about connecting from our corner of the world to the rest of the world, and we do that through connections through aviation. There's a saying that says, "Give a person a mile of road, and they've traveled a mile. Give someone a mile of runway, and they can go anywhere in the world." And that's really the excitement that aviation provides. So we're excited about the future here at Las Cruces International from an aviation perspective, and we hope that you join us in some of that excitement. So thank you very much for your attention, and let me queue up our next speaker. And if you have comments, what we'll do is we will be tracking them in the chat box, as Monica pointed out at the outset, and we will be able to address them as we move along later on in the presentation. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Dale Amon. Dale is the president and CEO of Immortal Data. He is going to be presenting on space transportation infrastructure in New Mexico, past, present, and future. And he's going to give us an overview on the past, present, and future of new space in New Mexico. And he's going to give us an introduction on the way that regional space capabilities tie together. So very excited to hear about this from Mr. Dale Amon. So with that, take it away, Dale. Dale, I think you're muted, sir.
Okay, is this clear now? Okay.
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. I picked my lead-in slide intentionally because for many people who are not directly involved in this new industry, it seems very science fiction, where in reality, we're entering a ramp-up era and a new industry where there are tens of billions of dollars in capital flowing into this. And what you see here is one of our local companies with a model of their space plane, which should be flying with passengers this year, sitting in front of City Hall here. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, there are very, very deep roots in this region into the space flight. And one could, in fact, make the case that real spaceflight work began in New Mexico. Dr. Robert Goddard started off up in Connecticut, I believe, and he had a bit of trouble there because it was a bit crowded for launching rockets, and he annoyed a number of people. So he came down here to the Roswell area, where the world's first liquid rocket engines were fired right over there. And the liquid rocket engine is one of the keys to space flight that led on towards the moon launches. Next slide. Now, from there, the next step was over during World War II, a team of brilliant engineers at Peenemünde were working on some of the first practical rockets, and they actually reached into space. So they were the very first to get a vehicle up above what's now called the von Karman line. And at the end of the war, that entire team came out or was brought out here to New Mexico, and they resided in Las Cruces, and they did all of their work up in what became White Sands. That they had quite a few of the V2s that had been brought over as war booty, essentially, and they launched most of those and started developing new vehicles. After Las Cruces, von Braun, as you may know, went on to be one of the primary advocates of American spaceflight and was one of the principal people in the design of the moon rocket. Next slide. Another thing that happened here is a lot of the early aeromedical work happened here in this area. Out at Holloman Air Force Base, Colonel John Stapp set the world's record on just an unbelievable acceleration. Nobody has been foolish enough to try to beat it, but he was quite a safety advocate. He invented the 3-point safety harness that almost all of us use, and was a very, very important researcher for years afterwards. And on the right, you see the current unmanned rocket sled up at Holloman, and they still do some really amazing work up there with that. So next slide. Now, the very first crew to go around the moon was in December, Christmas Eve, in I believe that was 1968. The leader of that group settled here in Las Cruces. In fact, if you look down below, you'll see Borman Ford, and that was run by Frank Borman's son. He also had a Spitfire. The photo there is a newer one, but that's the same Spitfire he owned. And it was based up here at KLRU. And the hangar that our local EAA chapter uses was his hangar. Next. Also, many of us became aware of KLRU back in 2005 and 6. Pretty much everybody in this industry knows of this airport, and it's because of these events in 2005 and 6. There were multiple things that occurred on those. One was the X Prize Cup, where they had most of the people who were working towards winning the X Prize had their vehicles out here. And there was the NASA Lunar Lander Challenge that was also going on, which was part of the events. It was just a massive event that had people from all over the world coming into this airport. And you'll notice the company I used to work for is up there in the right-hand corner. And over on the left-hand corner, you can see the giant screen with which people could watch the lander attempts. And the vehicle on there, if I recognize it correctly, was, oh, let's see. Actually, I'm not sure which one. I think that was Armadillo Aerospace. So next slide. You can see there was quite a variation of vehicles there, and up in the left-hand slide, it's a little bit hard to see, but that vehicle flying up above is a rocket plane. That was X-Corps' Easy Rocket, and it was doing a demonstration on aerobatics over the field right outside the door here. And on the lower right-hand corner, they were also doing a tether challenge where the ones who could build the best vehicle for climbing a tether were the winners. And that had people from all over the world on that challenge. Now, you might not know about the idea of tethers, but one concept for very cheap access to space is to literally have an elevator up to geosynchronous orbit. And I will not go into the physics of it, but many people have, and it would work. It's just exceedingly expensive. At the time the idea was invented, we didn't have the materials to do it. But funny enough, 50 years later, we have materials that would work for it. We just don't have the capital or the amount of space flight that would support such a thing at present. Next slide. Now, there's some things left over from that test. We have still got the lunar landing challenge pads in quite good shape. And you'll see our moderator standing there. He kindly let me go out and inspect those pads. There are two pads like the one he is standing on. And then there is another pad, which was a simulated lunar area. That's why those holes and rocks and things are quite intentional. So the second part of the challenge after it did the flight on from one pad to another was to make a flight to the third pad, which it had to touch down on where there were little craters and rocks and somehow come to rest without destroying itself. Next slide. We have recently had a small event out here, which we hope was going to build into something bigger. And it shows how much interest there is in aerospace in our region. The Wings and Wheels in 2019 attracted perhaps 3,000 people, which was a great shock to the organizers who did not see that there would be that much pent-up desire for involvement in aerospace here. And we had a number of the aerospace companies out here, not a whole lot on that one, but Andy and others are working towards getting a much larger event. Well, this year will be about the same as the small one you see there. And next year, we're hoping to have something really large. Next slide. There is a great deal in this area that is related to aerospace. If you have not been out to Alamogordo and the New Mexico Museum of Space History, you really owe it to yourself to go out there. I don't know if they have opened up yet after the COVID things, but the publicly accessible parts of it have a big slice of history of space flight. And on top of that, they also have a research archive with the notes and papers from many luminaries in the industry. And they also just happen to be the repository for the National Space Society's collection of papers. That has a little due to me since I'm one of the directors of the National Space Society. Next slide. Now, we already have space flight occurring. Virgin Galactic is out at Spaceport America, and they have done flights above the von Karman line, which is sort of the official altitude for space flight. Although I think actually they may have been a little bit lower, but still in what the Air Force does for space flight astronaut wings. I'll note that the photograph in the upper left is from some years ago out in Mojave, and that's my own photograph. I was right there on the side of the runway working with another company, and we all got to watch the entire flight. Next. There are currently quite a few companies that are operating up at Spaceport America. There's Up Aerospace, in which my company actually has a payload that's going to fly in November. And there's Garvey Aerospace, Exos Aerospace. Exos is the child of Armadillo Aerospace, pretty much. And then there's Spin Launch, which is a very interesting concept where they take a huge centrifuge and they spin these vehicles around and they exit at Mach numbers, which is higher than the speed of sound, so that they get essentially their boost is from this centrifuge, and then they fire their rocket engines after they get to a high altitude. Next. Now, as Andy said in the introduction, I want to point out that space is a regional industry. It's very important to our entire nation. And there is a cluster developing here in our region that could be very, very important to the future of American space industry. If you look at the map, you'll notice that there are spaceports over in Midland. Blue Origin, with its New Glenn rocket, is flying in Van Horn. Yeah, thank you. And then everybody knows about White Sands Missile Range and Holloman, where there's been ongoing flights. There is Spaceport America, which has had vehicles fly already. Up above there's Kirtland Air Force Base, where both the Air Force Research Labs and the new U.S. Space Force have a presence. And then there is going way over the other side, over in Tucson, Arizona, there is Worldview, which is the edge of space experience using a giant balloon. And there's Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, where anybody who needs to get an old Air Force airplane, that is a resource for test vehicles if you need to get something. And then sitting right smack dab in the middle of it all is KLRU. And KLRU has currently 2 new space companies. They've got some subsidiary operations of Virgin Galactic, and they've got my own small company. Now, I'm not going to have the chutzpah, as it were, to put us in the same category as Richard Branson, but you know, we're smaller, so we try harder. Next slide. Now, there's more to transportation than just the roads, which are also important. But as anybody who does military work or pretty much anything industrial will be able to tell you, it's logistics, logistics, logistics. You need ways to get large amounts of material to particular places on time and on budget. And rail has been for a very long time extremely important to that capability. And guess what? We've got a very good rail network in this region that if Andy can manage to get a rail spur up here, this would make KLRU a very, very good place for a staging area for various companies. Next slide. Now, there is behind the scenes another effort, which is to have a high altitude, high speed corridor for testing some of these new rocket vehicles the manned type of vehicles to go between Midland and Spaceport America. This is not something that's approved yet, but it's being discussed in high levels. It would mean that something like a Virgin Galactic vehicle could fly from here to Midland and back, to show that that could be done, and that this would be the initiation of this concept of having intercontinental flights using rockets. Next slide. Okay. Now, that brings me to the end of my basic presentation, and I hope that you can see that there has been and is a great deal going on in this area, and the potential for Las Cruces is enormous if we can act as a central point to all of this infrastructure. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dale. I appreciate that. And let me get this switched over here. While I'm doing that, it is my privilege to introduce Mr. James Bennett. Mr. Bennett is Chief Regulatory Officer, also with Immortal Data. And I will get his presentation queued up here. And Mr. Bennett is going to be speaking to us on the topic of the new emerging space launch industry and Las Cruces' place in its need for spaceports. And just to give a little blurb on Mr. Bennett's presentation, he's going to give an overview of the space launch industry and the third wave of launch companies and spaceports. And Las Cruces has some unique selling points in the new spaceport market that is emerging, and it would be synergistic with other capabilities in this region. So with that, Mr. Bennett, I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Andy. Dale gave us a very nicely illustrated discussion of New Mexico and its history in space and its some of the current capabilities of commercial space, which are locating into Las Cruces and New Mexico in general. My presentation covers some of the same ground, but much more from the perspective of the entire launch industry, and explaining a bit of its history, which is important to understand why certain past endeavors over the last couple of decades did not come to fruition, or at least did not come to fruition on schedule, and why third time seems to be the charm. So thank you, Andy. Looking at the first slide. And I have to make it clear that we're talking about a fundamental change in the nature of the space launch industry worldwide, and particularly in the United States. The USA has been the leader in this kind of development, and for the time being remains so. We had for a long time a legacy launch industry. In other words, the ICBMs that were developed in the 1940s and 1950s for government purpose, like the Atlas missile, the Thor missile, the Titan missile, and their descendants are still scattered in silos around the United States, were turned into space launchers in the late 1950s and early 1960s, because the US government actually understood quite early the advantage that reconnaissance satellites could bring to warfare, especially Eisenhower, who had spent a lot of the previous decade really wishing that he had had good space photos of Germany and its capabilities before he undertook D-Day. Immediately saw that we needed to go ahead in 1954. He approved the RAND Corporation's, at that time, highly classified project feedback report, which said, turn the Atlas missile into a space launcher and get a recon satellite up there ASAP. However, hold back and don't launch it until the Russians have launched something first, so there's no legal hassles over the right to overfly territory and take photographs. Said if we do it first, the Russians will to launch legal challenges to it. If they do it first, they can't complain when we do it. And that worked. Unfortunately, Sputnik had a much bigger shock effect than the government had expected, and they had to create a whole civilian space agency to take military technology and give it a civilian spin, and thus NASA was born in 1958. So NASA took these military missiles, which had been adapted to satellite launch for the purposes of the Air Force and the intelligence agencies, and launched a relatively small number of communication satellites and a few other applications, as well as interplanetary probes in the moon program. And after Apollo, of course, the need for communication satellites continued, and we had a launch industry, but it was high cost, government dominated, and using these old military technologies, which weren't really optimally adapted to commercial flight use. And they were kind of stuck in that paradigm for a long time. The space shuttle was the government's attempt to break out of this paradigm. They said, all right, let's go for reusability. We need wings there. And gee, we should put all payloads on one rocket design. Well, that doesn't work any better in spacecraft than it does in aircraft or trucks or anything else. You need various different designs adapted to specific customer needs. And a small group of people in the early 80s said, the shuttle, even if it performs as the government says it's going to, isn't going to meet the needs of the market. And the only other way to get it is for private companies to get capitalized and compete. Fortunately, Silicon Valley had a few crazy billionaires who were willing to start putting money into it. Unfortunately, it was not all that much. So over the past several decades, starting in the early 1980s, and I can say that because I was involved in those early attempts, we had many attempts. Some of them got as far as financing the construction of prototypes and trying to launch them. Some of those launches were successful, others not so much. So the industry never, to coin a phrase, took off. And in the same vein, since at first we couldn't use government spaceports, and secondly, government spaceports, like government launch vehicles, were high cost and burdened by a lot of bureaucracy and government paperwork. That's the same thing, but it was burdensome to operate there, and I can say that because I tried it myself. But finally, between the critical mass of investors coming together and a few more crazy billionaires decided to get really serious about the amount of money they put in, i.e. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson. Well, Richard didn't use his own money, but that's a whole other story, as people in New Mexico are very well aware. But this is finally happening. Now you're seeing SpaceX has put up over 900 satellites in its Starlink communication system, which uses an entirely different approach than past communication satellites, made possible by frequent cheap launch. And as a result of this takeoff of new launch companies, we've had a takeoff of interest in new spaceports. Commercially run, commercially oriented spaceports. You can't really run an effective commercial launch company out of a government spaceport any more than you could run a successful airline out of an Air Force base. And in fact, the spaceports are Air Force bases, except for Wallops, which is a NASA facility, which is maybe even worse. So the new spaceports allow spaceports to start specializing in their own roles. This is something we haven't had in the past. We only had the absolute minimum specialization caused by the need to launch to different orbits from different locations, which is why we have both Canaveral and Vandenberg as government spaceports. But now we need a much larger diversity of spaceports, and this is causing an expansion of spaceport projects. Next slide, please. Andy. Thank you. Pathfinders. In the 1980s, we had a few ventures. GCH in space services built the Percheron. It blew up on the launch pad. My first company, ARC, which became Starstruck, backed by Silicon Valley millionaire Mike Scott from Apple, built the Dolphin, a sea-launched rocket, which had a successful low altitude test, similar to the low altitude tests SpaceX has been doing down in Boca Chica. Although it was technically successful and we were ready to go on to higher level tests, we had a shareholder fight between two different Silicon Valley billionaires on our board, and it went out of business for financial and organizational reasons rather than technical reasons. SSI continued with using a different technical basis. They launched the Conestoga rocket in the mid-'80s. Several veterans from Starstruck got together and formed American Rocket Company, or AMROC, which fired a large number of hybrid rocket engines. Its first test basically failed to achieve its goals, burned on the pad. That's the way it goes. But unfortunately, the investors were not willing to take it further. The technology eventually got folded into a series of companies, which today ended up being Sierra Nevada, which is using those hybrid engines as the main propulsion in their Dream Chaser launch vehicle. The hybrids that we designed also ended up being used in the first X Prize flight to space, the Spaceship One, and is also now being used in Virgin Galactic Spaceship Two. So when I see Virgin spaceships going up, I remember firing the predecessors of those rockets. But the point was that all these little companies were taking new approaches, new technologies, and we set new regulatory precedents. And we also had to find alternatives to operating out of the high-cost government ranges. Capital markets just basically thought it was too weird and too new, and we could get some money to try building prototypes, but never enough to get the job done. So that first wave of the 80s basically fizzled out, sometimes spectacularly. The second wave, it was the 1990s to the 2000s. A lot of veterans from the companies of the first wave went on and being complete masochists, formed a second wave of companies. And they were joined by more veterans from the traditional aerospace industry who started to say, we really need new and different approaches, and these are the guys that are doing it. I mean, we kept getting people from the old school companies saying, you guys are doing it the way we did it in the 50s when we were inventing the whole field. NASA and the Air Force have just gotten too stagnant. So veterans from the first wave jump-started the second wave. You know, companies like Rotary Rocket, Kistler, Rocket Plane, Beale, etc., some of which actually managed to build hardware and attempt flights. This was different because the economic driver was this idea of using large numbers of small satellites in low orbits as opposed to a few big, incredibly expensive satellites 22,300 miles out in space, which was the traditional communication satellite. Better antenna capabilities on the ground side made these, because of the advances in the electronics industry, started to make these feasible in the late 90s, early 2000s. These constellations, a very large number of small satellites, were going to require many, many launches. Iridium Teledesic was one of the first ultra-large constellations. These people were veterans of the 1980s Star Wars research, which had required a very large number of satellites in orbit to sense the upcoming enemy rockets and direct the fire to them. The battle management architecture basically was civilianized and used as the basis of Teledesic, and then today's big constellations like Starlink are basically resurrections of the Teledesic architecture. And real money was going into this time. So people in the late 90s, early 2000s were very, very optimistic about the prospects. It all looked right. So a number of new spaceport projects were started in anticipation of the second wave launch needs, particularly Kodiak, which actually got into operation up in Alaska. Oklahoma took an old Air Force base and made some progress in that direction. There are a number of others around the country. But the second wave failed partly because of the costs of the constellations were very high. And secondly, terrestrial options, cellular technology proliferated and got cheaper much faster than was originally estimated, and kind of undercut the original market estimates for the constellations and frightened the capital sources away. So capital was pulled out, and suddenly projects, including these spaceport projects, which had been launched with so much hope and relatively realistic expectations of traffic, suddenly got stranded, to the great embarrassment of politicians who had gone out on a limb to back them. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Andy. Andy, next slide, please.
Is the third wave, I think, is next slide.
Yeah.
Is it showing up on your screen?
It's not showing up on my screen.
Yes, we can see third wave.
Okay, I'm not seeing it on my screen for some reason. Okay. So after the failure of the second wave and the stranding of many of these prospects, a third wave started to emerge first in the 2000s and then in the teens. Tourism was a big driver this time, and as well as yet another wave of LEO satellite constellation concepts. SpaceX, of course, was going after the satellite market as well as humans in space. Blue Origin, similarly. Virgin ended up on two tracks, one of which with Virgin Galactic and Spaceship Two went after the suborbital tourism market. And of course, you're familiar with that because it's operating out of Spaceport America. They also had a separate track for orbital satellite launches, which led to Launcher One, which has been recently successfully launched into orbit. And of course, the OneWeb as a constellation project, which faltered for a while financially, not technically, but has been rescued by the British government and some international investment from the Emirates. The scale of support of these and the US use of private capabilities, as NASA started to realize that SpaceX was a cheaper way of getting their own astronauts to their own space station than anything they could build or buying it from the Russians, which is what we had been using since the shuttle was retired. Suddenly turned the corner on the financial community's perception of space. And now there's a space investment boom. This has resulted in new launch approaches, generating new needs for spaceports in the US and elsewhere. Again, as I mentioned on the previous slide, there are many different uses of spaceports, and different spaceports are optimal for different uses. So you had the very successful Mojave Air and Spaceport, which is used primarily for research and development of new vehicles, and many entrepreneurial companies have located there and have grown up. And that is the model that we have in mind for Las Cruces. Similar, it's the blue collar side of the space launch, and Las Cruces has characteristics which make it well adapted to that. Spaceport America is not blue collar, it is the glitzy celebrity spaceport, optimized for tourism, and therefore we're concentrating on the aesthetics and the experience. Kodiak is a survivor of the second wave, being supported by the state of Alaska. They hung in there, and now they are getting a lot of entrepreneurial activity as well, being the only spaceport that doesn't have to worry too much about perimeter security because they have 10-foot bears performing that function. SpaceX and the Blue Origin have proprietary spaceports in Texas. However, in the future, they will not necessarily be locating all of their activity, even their developmental activity, in those locations. And of course, they both operate out of Kennedy or Cape Canaveral base. New Zealand has a very successful private spaceport used to put several satellites in orbit by the company Rocket Labs, which is a very interesting international US and New Zealand run launch company, which I think is been one of the more successful. The United Kingdom is developing 2 and possibly 3 spaceports. They have decided to get into the game again after an early start, which was shut down for financial reasons. And after launching satellites in the early 70s, they are back in it now. This is going to be something we're going to see. A lot of governments are going to say the cost of getting into space has gone down so much, and the technology is so generally available that every nation can have the prestige of its own launcher, not to mention the national security benefits. Next slide, please. New Mexico is an active player in spaceports. Of course, you have White Sands, which is a major federal facility and has been for a long time for suborbital activity. And you will also recall as a landing site for the space shuttle. Spaceport America will be a major private spaceport for suborbital tourism and research flights, as it already is beginning to be. One of the scarce resources for spaceports is reserved airspace. The White Sands Missile Range, WSMR airspace, is one of the oldest and very most stable, reliable reserved airspaces for space activity in the country, and is likely to be into the far future. Spaceport America basically uses the WSMR airspace area, and they have access to it under federal legislation. I knew because I drafted some of the legislation. The same legislation would also permit access for activities out of Las Cruces, although you do have to go through a process of application and approval. And there are a number of issues that need to be studied as far as to what kind of activities ultimately could be done out of Las Cruces, but that's addressable. That's a known topic, and we know how to address it. Las Cruces, as Dale nicely illustrated, has already hosted low-level private rocket activities in the 2000s, particularly the Maston technology, which is now being used in lunar lander applications. This activity was conducted safely and with no negative impact on local population. There was no uproar about it, which is nice. We have a precedent, and when we go back to the public, we can say we're just proposing going back and taking something that we have done before, done successfully, and without any major annoyance to the population. We're expanding on that, but thoughtfully and carefully. Some infrastructure remains. The test pads that you saw in Dale's talk, they could be reused. They could be the basis of new construction. From a regulatory standpoint, what makes me happy is that they are in the category of disturbed earth, unquote. So the ability to go back on them and build them means we have a much lower environmental study process, and we don't have to worry about the archaeological or undisturbed earth issues. Those have been resolved already. So that makes them quite attractive. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, that's the wrong slide.
Jim,
So
you
we're
have a
working-
few of my slides left over.
Looks like a couple of those inadvertently got in. But what we're looking at in the greater southern New Mexico
You want me
area,
to go on to the next one, James?
you should have the one called a spaceport triangle.
Yes.
Okay. Commercial space launch is a growth industry, and it's likely to double several times over the coming decade at a minimum. The curves that we are plotting internally actually are crazier than that, but I'm just trying to be conservative. Spaceport towns generate a range of well-paid jobs from technical and scientific to skilled blue collar and even unskilled blue collar, because these places need to have support and service and security. So they generate a wide variety of jobs, but particularly they are a good strategy for keeping your college graduates in town after graduation. And I've, been involved in spaceport projects in a couple of different areas, and that always came back. People said, we got smart kids, we have a nice university, they get degrees, and if they have any interest in exciting things, space, computers, etc., then they go off and they go out of state, and we lose them. And we lose them both family-wise and economy-wise. Having a spaceport town, Mojave is an exception to that, because so many exciting things happen. Interesting people moving to Mojave, and they basically make a more diverse economic base for the whole town, and start causing beneficial social impacts as well. Basically, you give young kids hope of interesting things they can be doing in their own town. As I said, we're kind of using Mojave as a successful model, partly because IDI was originally based in Mojave, being essentially a spinoff from XCOR. Most of us were employees of or consultants to XCOR, including myself. So it was a team that already knew. We were determined to get out of California. We knew we had to get out of California because of the negative regulatory aspects and the very high cost of living. I mean, owning a house shouldn't be a dream that you say, after I win the lottery, I'll be able to own a house. This is driving a lot of middle-class people out of California, and it's probably going to escalate rather than reduce. Mojave was an incubator for many private space companies to date, including ours. As I mentioned, cost of living, taxes, and really crazy regulation. I'm not against sensible regulation, as I've spent my whole career helping the government evolve sensible regulation for the industries. But the federal isn't too bad, actually. I mean, it needs to evolve more, but because the industry is evolving so long. But some state and local authorities in various areas have been quite irrational about it, and there are some suspect motivations for that. LRU could capture a non-trivial part of such migration in the commercial space industry. We would work in concert with, not in competition with, White Sands and Spaceport America. Each has different roles, each has different functions. The fact that Virgin Galactic puts its office functions in Las Cruces and not at Spaceport America just illustrates what we're saying. Las Cruces is the place to put almost anything except the tourist launch activities. Wismar would continue to be the defense and security location. Space America would continue and would grow as a space tourism operational area. Las Cruces could host both the research and development and the support area, together forming what I call the spaceport triangle for New Mexico. Next slide, please. LRU's advantages as an R&D spaceport. Have we got that?
Yes, that one is up, sir.
Okay, thanks. Logistics. As a rocket company executive, was in charge of looking at potential launch sites for our activities. I would get an Excel spreadsheet out and I would do a database of all the different factors that were important. And I would assign a weighting factor to them. And it kept coming out as logistics being by far the single most important consideration for location. And the optimal location kept coming out as an inland US location with low population density surrounding it and good airspace. As a matter of fact, this was so overwhelming that I had to keep readjusting the weighting factors in order to get anything else on the chart at all. So when you're looking at where do you want to put a spaceport, well, first is airspace, but secondly is logistics, and I would also say third, fourth, and fifth are also logistics. When you're out there at the launch site and you discover that you need a tool or a meter or a device or anything that you hadn't expected, you don't want to have to spend hours or days getting it from a remote location. You want an industrial capability nearby in the town and in the region. Las Cruces has the basic set. El Paso is a close enough drive that you're still getting same day service on this. If you're on a Spaceport America, even if you need anything as small as a paperclip that they don't actually happen to have, you've lost a day. It's a nice place for a lot of things, but it's not a good place for research and development, and it's not that good of a place for support. And the French have a fantastic location in French Guiana in South America. It's right on the equator. It's really optimal for launching communication satellites to orbit. But I've talked to engineers who have supported launches at Kourou, which is the name of it, and they hate it. They said, if you lack anything whatsoever, they have to send all the way back to Paris for it, and it has to come on the overnight flight, and you don't see it. If you see it the next day, you're lucky. It's usually 2 or 3 days. It's just a really frustrating place to work out of. Also very boring because it's a small, highly isolated spot, whereas, technicians are on site for maybe 6 weeks before launch happens. They like to be in a civilized place with something to do in your off hours. So location is extremely important. Accessibility, as Dale said, rails. Most of the heavy equipment comes in by rail, if not by truck, and you want an interstate for that. And of course, air is extremely important. One of the things that makes me really happy and optimistic about Las Cruces as an operational location is the report that Andy referred to, giving a real possibility of direct service out of LRU into DFW or Phoenix, both of which are very connection rich. I mean, I really like the idea of getting on your connector flight in Las Cruces and making only one connection in a place that then gets you to your destination, and that has so many flights in and out that if you miss your connection, it's not the only connection of the day. You probably have 5 or 6 more flights to that destination left, even after you've gotten delayed. So all of those transport options are very welcome, and they speak well for Las Cruces. The prior history supporting space development activities, both in terms of convincing the population that this is a desirable and not problematic thing, and like I said, the straightforward regulatory benefit that I don't have to worry about the disturbed earth issue or the archaeology issue. Then the environmental issue is made much easier by the prior activity. Plentiful, low-cost space in the traditional sense of acreage for industrial and residential use. I really like when you're looking at spaceport candidates, areas that have land around the airport that's not FAA land. A lot of airports only have land basically lent to them by the federal government, which carries a large number of restrictions and impediments to using it for development activities. The university is very important. The university, it gives you a stream of graduates to hire, it gives you a stream of students to be interns, and it makes the town more desirable as a place to convince people to relocate to. I would really always prefer a university town as a location for a spaceport, and Las Cruces is well placed in that regard. Pro-economic growth mentality, you've got a history of going out of your way to support sensible projects. And of course, the existing research capabilities of the federal government and of other people in the area makes it also attractive. There's projects, there's cooperation, there are customers for the launch companies. And we can expect aerospace is going to be more crowded, especially as a launch to outer space becomes more directly controlled by the FAA. This is inevitable as the pace of launch picks up. The Wismar Aerospace will likely be grandfathered and is less likely to come under new restrictions than going to an area with no previous activity in space and getting the FAA to reserve it for space activities. Next slide, please.
This is a friendly reminder. You have about 4 minutes till the end of the session.
Great. We are just about to wrap up here. For all the things I mentioned, we are at a unique moment. We are at the knee of the curve. We're making this transition from the old-fashioned legacy launch industry to an entirely new and different type of launch industry, which is now experiencing and will continue to experience very substantial growth. This needs more facilities to support it, i.e. spaceports. Las Cruces is well placed in its characteristics for this. And I will just finish then by saying that you've got a lot of specific advantages at LRU. I've already kind of gone over them. New generation does not need big fixed infrastructures or exotic fuels. If you go to Mojave, it's not a giant place like Canaveral. It's busy, but it's all human scale type equipment for the most part. And, since we have to pay our own liability insurance, we don't use highly hazardous fuels or other materials. So I think it's a good match for New Mexico. New Mexico is a good match for the space industry, and Las Cruces is a good match for those particular requirements. So we're optimistic, and we hope you will be too. Thank you.